Hi everyone. So I'm very happy to introduce Stephanie Jones. She's an associate professor at Brown University, and her lab uses computational models, biophysical computational models, to try to understand brain dynamics. And particularly, she has had a strong focus on understanding EEG and MEG signals, as well as looking into different neurostimulation methods. And she's also the developer of the human Cortical neurosolver. This is really interesting tool she's going to talk about. And we've also been collaborating for a few years now, trying to integrate both our tools, NetPyNE with this HNN tool. So welcome everybody, Stephanie Jones, and thank you so much for giving this talk. Please.
So thank you, Salvador. I'm thrilled to be here to get a chance to talk to you guys about this tool that we've developed called Human Neocortical Neurosolver that we're designing for cell and circuit origin of human EEG and MEG. And as Salva mentioned, we've been working to integrate some of these tools with the NetPyNE tools, and I'll talk briefly about that at the end of my presentation. If anybody wants to interrupt me, I think we do have time for that. So Salva, if you want to monitor the chat or the hand raise, I'm happy to stop along the way and answer questions, or if anybody has questions at the end, we can wait till then.
I'll monitor. And just a comment, we see your bar at the bottom with all the icons. Perfect.
We'll get there. My apology for the delay. Okay, so I'm going to start by hopefully getting to the right screen. By describing the challenge in human neuroscience that we aim to address with the development of this tool. So in my lab, we study human electrophysiology. We collect both MEG and EEG, magneto and electroencephalography. And these are really powerful techniques because they allow us to study human brain dynamics with millisecond resolution in both health and disease, and we can do this in adults and children. We can combine it with brain stimulation. It's a really powerful technology to study the human brain. But a downside is what we're recording is the so-called macro scale activity. It's generated by large ensembles of neurons, and it's still really difficult to infer, well, what's going on at this underlying cellular and circuit level? And this circuit level understanding is really critical if we want to know why these signals correlate with function, or if we want to develop treatments when they're disrupted in neuropathology, either brain stimulation or pharmacology. Now, invasive recordings in animal models are ideal for dissecting circuit level dynamics and things like optogenetics and all the tools we have now to modulate circuit activity, but there's difficulty still in applying this in the human. And so to bridge this scale, we've been using computational neuromodeling. And computational modeling is ideal for bridging these scales because what we can do is we can develop models that have enough detail to capture the biophysical origin of these macro scale signals, but connect to all of the underlying cellular and circuit level dynamics. And so this has been a primary focus of my lab. And we've recently turned this modeling framework into this software tool that we're calling Human Neocortical Neurosolver. And we're designing it for the EEG and MEG community to be able to start to develop and test predictions on the origin of their human EEG signals. So the outline of my talk, I'm going to start by just giving you some background on the development of this tool and what's included within it. I'm going to give you an example of how we've applied this tool to study sensory event-related potentials, and I'll work with data that we've collected in my lab. I'll then show you another application where we've been applying HNN to try to uncover the circuit mechanisms underlying non-invasive brain stimulation. And in my lab, we've been using both alternating current stimulation and TMS. And so I'll give you an example of that. And at the end, I'm going to briefly describe some of everything that I'm going to talk about at the beginning of the talk is with our graphical user interface. But at the end, I'm going to describe how we now also have a command line interface. And we've been working really hard to make clean open source code and in integration with some of the NetPyNE tools. So how do we go about developing a biophysically principled model that can connect these macro scale signals that we're collecting outside of the head in humans down to these circuit level dynamics? Well, the first thing we have to think about is where these signals come from. So what we do is we collect this sensor data and we apply what's called an inverse solution method. What that method does is it estimates the location, the direction, and the time course of these big electrical currents in the brain that produce these sensor level signals. We call those primary currents. And so when you take your signal, you apply these inverse methods, you get a picture of where the currents are in the brain and how they change over time. That's called a primary current. This primary current is generated by the postsynaptic intracellular current flow and these long and spatially aligned cortical pyramidal neuron dendrites. Essentially, these are aligned in such a way across the cortex that the net summed activity across huge populations of these pyramidal neurons creates this big electrical current that creates an electric and magnetic field that we're recording outside of the head. So given that this is where the signal is coming from, there are some key canonical features of cortical circuitry that we need to be including in the model in order to get at the cellular and circuit origin of this signal. The first is that the cortex is a layered structure. There's pyramidal neurons with these long extended apical dendrites in both the supragranular and infragranular layers. They're synaptically coupled to inhibitory neurons with both fast and slow neurotransmitter, which I'll talk about again in a minute. These networks don't sit in isolation, but they're always receiving inputs from other parts of the brain. And there's two primary pathways of input to the cortex. One is what we call the feed-forward input. This is the input that comes from what's called the lemniscal thalamus, and it relays sensory information. You tap the finger, the signal comes in, it goes through the thalamus, and then it propagates to the granular layers, and from there to the other layers that have these pyramidal neuron dendrites. The other pathway of input, which is often referred to as feedback input, it comes right into the supragranular layers. Now, this could come from higher order cortical areas. There's also these non-specific or non-lemniscal thalamic nuclei that are known to project right up to the supragranular layers. And so we include these two pathways of drive to this local cortical column structure. Now, the primary current dipole signal, as I mentioned, comes from the intracellular current flow across all of the pyramidal neurons in the population. And with this construction, the units of measure that you get out of a model are current times distance, or nanoampere meters. That is the same unit of measure that we get from our source localized signal. And so with this construction, we have one-to-one correspondence between the output of our model and our source localized data. And that's proved to be a really powerful way to start to develop and test predictions on the origin of these macro scale signals. Now, we know something about the size of some of the most commonly measured signals. So when you record outside of the head, you're really typically only looking at a few things. You're looking at either ERPs, event-related potentials. You give some kind of a sensory stimulus and you get an ERP. The other thing that you see are these low frequency oscillations, typically under 100 hertz in the alpha, beta, gamma bands. ERPs are usually on the order of 10 to 100 nanoampere meters. They're thought to be generated by on the order of tens of thousands of synchronously firing pyramidal neurons. These low frequency oscillations are huge. They're much bigger, and they're thought to be, they're 100 to 1,000 nanoampere meters, and they're thought to be generated by the subthreshold activity of on the order of 1 million pyramidal neurons. So it's not that the whole brain is spiking at some 10 hertz oscillation, but you've got some big modulatory current flow across a swath of cortex that creates these low frequency oscillations. Now, just to give you a little bit more detail about what's in our neural model, we have, this is simulated in NeuronPython, and now NetPyNE, as I'll describe at the end. But we have these multi-compartment pyramidal neurons in the supragranular and infragranular layers. We have single compartment inhibitory neurons because these aren't contributing directly to the recorded signal, but they're very important for the dynamics that the network expresses. We have both fast and slow GABAergic and glutamatergic synapses. We simulate the electrical activity in each compartment with Hodgkin-Huxley dynamics, which I'm sure you've been studying in this workshop. And then we get the intracellular current flow from cable theory, from Rawls equations. And this comes out naturally or automatically out of neuron. Then we simulate the primary current dipole signal by just summing up this intracellular current flow across all of the populations of pyramidal neurons. And this is what we compare, again, to our source localized signal. Now, as I've mentioned, these networks are receiving input from other parts of the brain. So any simulation that we do is going to consist of, okay, well, what are we going to do to this network? And what we're going to do is we're going to drive it with trains of action potentials in some predefined pattern activity that we choose that's going to activate excitatory synapses in the local network through these feed-forward or feedback projection patterns. Now, in our model, in HNN, we refer to them as proximal and distal drive because that's where they effectively hit the pyramidal neuron dendrites. They either hit the proximal dendrites or the distal dendrites. And what this input does, and we're not simulating every part of the brain. We're just generating trains of action potentials and hitting it into this local cortical column structure. And so, for example, if we have a sequence of feed-forward drive, what that's going to do is it's going to activate the proximal dendrites, and then it can push current flow up the dendrites. If I had distal drive, you get excitatory input to the distal dendrites, and that can push current flow down the dendrites to create this negative deflecting signal. And so you've got this integration of feed-forward and feedback drive interacting with the local dynamics, and that creates this net current dipole that we're going to record. So that is a reduced representation of the model. The full model is representing a patch of cortex. It contains a scalable number of pyramidal neurons in the supragranular and infragranular layers. They're in a 3-to-1 ratio with these inhibitory neurons. And we're designing this software specifically to study some of the most commonly measured EEG and MEG signals, including ERPs and low-frequency brain rhythms. We're concentrating right now on alpha rhythms, beta rhythms, and gamma rhythms because those are the signals that we've studied in the lab. Now, as you can imagine, this is a really complicated, large-scale network model. There's thousands of differential equations, even more parameters. And so what we've been working on with HNN is to try to develop a tool that the community can use and take all that complication out of the hands of the user. And so we're embedding this model in a graphical user interface. We created a website, hnn.brown.edu, that has installation instructions. We give tutorials on how to use this graphical user interface to start to study ERPs, alpha rhythms, beta rhythms, and gamma rhythms. We give data from our own experiments in the parameter sets that correspond to those experiments. And the idea is that if we can teach the community how to study the baseline study of these commonly measured signals, then they'll have the tools to go and then apply it to their own data. And again, the name of the game here is that we're going to drive this network with some kind of input that represents our simulation experiment. And I'm going to walk through an example of that for you. So here I'm going to walk through an example of where we've used this to study tactile evoked responses. So in my lab, we do these experiments where we tap the finger and we ask the subject, did you feel it? Did you not feel it? And we're interested in correlates of perception in the signal. And so in our first study applying this model, we tried to understand, well, can we get at the origin of the tactile evoked response? So when you tap the finger and you record from the hand area of S1, and so we're taking our sensor level data, we're applying a source localization technique, and we're isolating the contribution to the signal from this hand area of S1. When we look at the response from that, and this is from just a strong tap to the finger, where the subject reports they felt it every time, you can see that there's this very reliable tactile evoked response. And so we wanted to use HNN to say, well, how is this coming about in the local circuit? And fortunate for us, there's a long history of studying the origin of the tactile evoked response with both EEG, MEG, and invasive recordings going back to the early 90s. And so we had this hypothesis based on this literature that what happens when you tap the finger is you get initial feed-forward input from the lemniscal thalamus. The input comes in, and it hits the cortex at approximately 25 milliseconds after you tap the finger. After that, it goes through the brain and it comes back into the cortex through a feedback input at about 70 milliseconds. Then there's the thalamocortical loop of activity that's engaged, and it comes back in through this feed-forward pathway at about 125 milliseconds. And so we wanted to use HNN to test the hypothesis. Can this sequence of activation generate this macro-scale ERP in this intracellular current flow signal? And so what we did is we took our model, we created this sequence of drives. So up here at the top of the graphical user interface, we're showing a histogram of the driving spikes through these proximal and distal pathways, or this feed forward and feedback pathway. So you can see here we have a histogram of spikes that's going to activate the feed forward pathway at approximately 25 milliseconds. Then we have these inputs that come in at approximately 70 milliseconds, a little bit earlier, and then again near 125 milliseconds. And so we simulate these inputs, and then we run our simulation, and the model spits out the net current dipole signal, this intracellular current flow. And you can see that this sequence of activation can indeed reproduce this electrical current flow in the pyramidal neuron dendrites that we've recorded. Now, importantly, we spent a long time tuning this input, right? We had this hypothesis, well, there should be some kind of feed forward, feedback, feed forward input. We know this. But what we had to do for a long time was say, well, how many inputs do we give? What's the strength of those inputs? How strong should they be to the inhibitory cells versus the excitatory cells? And so we tune this input very carefully in order to reproduce this evoked response. We now have some optimization tools in HNN where you can start to get kind of the baseline outline of your ERP, and then you run it through optimization, and that can improve the parameters to get a better fit to the signal. Now, because this is a model, and I'm not going to show this now, but I'll show it on another side, we can go in and we can look at the spiking activity of every neuron. We can go in and we can look at things like calcium dynamics. We can go in and we can look at layer-specific responses. And so we can start to dissect, well, this is the macro scale signal, but what's all the cellular and circuit level detail underlying this signal? And that's part of what you can get through the graphical user interface. Now, here I'm showing you an application of HNN where we've looked at other sensory evoked responses. And so here on the left is that brief tap to the finger that we just studied. In the middle is the brief presentation of a tone. I think in this case it's a letter. And you can see the response from the primary auditory cortex. And on the right is a brief flash of a checkerboard. And this is the response from the visual cortex. And one of the things that's really interesting about these responses is while there's clear differences, they have a similar pattern. They all start by going up, and then they go down, and then they go up again. And what we've shown with HNN, and this is, well, I guess now the A1's published, but not the V1, is that these three patterns of evoked responses can be generated by the same sequence of input. You get a feed forward, followed by a feedback, followed by a feed forward. And so again, here's the histogram of the driving input. Now again, we had to tune the timing, the strength, the number of those inputs in order to get a representation of the signal. But what this is suggesting is that this macro scale, these signals are really dictated by these macro scales features of cortical architecture, right? There's commonalities in the sequence of input from a sensory evoked response. There's commonalities in the laminar structure of each of these areas. And it's that commonality that's creating these similar features in our signal. And this is part of the reason why I think when you record with EEG and MEG, you only get so much. The field is looking at ERPs, alpha, beta, and gamma. And the reason that's what you get is because that's what the underlying structure dictates. You're not going to get all of the finite details. It's going to be dictated by cortical columns, pathways of information flow to the cortex. Okay, so now I'm going to move to, that was like our baseline study, ERPs. Now, in my lab, part of what we're doing is we're trying to understand the impact of non-invasive brain stimulation on the circuits and see if we can develop better brain stimulation paradigms by understanding what TMS or TACS, TACS we call it, is doing to the circuit through measuring what it's doing to an EEG signal. And so I'm going to step back a little bit and tell you about our experiment, and then I'll get back to how we're interpreting some of this with HNN. Okay, so as I mentioned, in my lab, we're studying tactile perception. We give brief taps to the finger and we ask the subject, did you feel it or didn't you feel it? And we're looking at the response from the hand area of S1. And I should mention, we always maintain the strength of the stimulus so that you feel it half of the time. So we can look at the brain dynamics on trials where they felt it and trials where they didn't feel it, and we'll have equal data to report that. So here is the spontaneous signal from the hand area of S1 before we tap the finger, right? The subject's just sitting there waiting for this tap to the finger. And you can see that there's this large amplitude, low frequency oscillation in the hand area of S1. If we put a frequency filter on that, this is a standard wavelet analysis. You see that there's a large component in what we call the alpha band, 7 to 14 hertz, and the beta band, 15 to 29 hertz. This is a really robust and reliable signal from the somatosensory cortex. We see this in every adult subject that we put in either MEG or EEG. And I say adult because when you look at kids, things are a little bit different. Kids have more alpha than beta, which is interesting. So the question we were interested in to start was, well, does the power of this pre-stimulus oscillation, it's always changing, right? You've got this ongoing oscillation. The power changes at any point in time. Does it impact the ability of the subject to feel the tap to the finger? And the answer to that question was yes. And so here I'm just showing you, I'm taking these spectrograms and I'm sorting over trials, averaging over trials where the subject said I felt it and I didn't feel it. And you can see very clearly when they didn't feel it, there's more of these low frequency oscillations in both the pre-stimulus and this post-stimulus period. Time zero here is where we tap the finger. And so we did some statistical analysis on this. Here I'm showing you, we're sorting every trial from low to high power. So whenever we tap the finger, we take this pre-stimulus period, we average across time, we average across frequency, we average across subjects, and we sort from low to high power. And then we look at the detection rate as a percent change in hit rate from the mean. So the higher it is, the more likely you are to say, yes, I felt that tap, and the lower you're saying I didn't feel that tap. And so what we saw with both alpha and beta is that when you have higher power, they're somehow inhibiting your ability to perceive that tap to the finger. We also found, and I'm not showing it in the slides, but when I tell you to pay attention to your finger, the power of these oscillations goes down, suggesting that they get out of the way with attention in order to optimize the ability to feel that information flow into the cortex, that tap to the finger. And so knowing that this is true, the first thing we did in our non-invasive brain stimulation studies was say, well, can we recreate these oscillations with brain stimulation? And by recreating them, can we actually inhibit tactile perception? And so we wanted to see, can we modulate them? And then we wanted to see if we can do that, can we use HNN to interpret what they're doing to the circuit by looking at what they're doing to the EEG signal. And so starting with this alpha finding, the first study that we did was one where we used alternating current stimulation. And so if you're not familiar with alternating current stimulation, it's basically you're putting a battery on the head and you're driving electrical current flow into the brain at whatever frequency you choose. And so here we said, well, let's drive alpha frequency oscillations into the primary somatosensory cortex, presumably in training alpha. I'm going to tell you in a minute that's not at all what happened. And then if we can do that, can we inhibit the ability to feel that tap to the finger? So we did this for very weak electrical stimuli. It was only 1 milliamp. We had this ramp where we had 6 seconds on and then 6 seconds off. Our hope was that we could look at the EEG signal during this off period. Turned out we couldn't, but that was the original design of our experiment. And then we compared it to a sham condition where what you do is you just turn it on because you can feel this electrical stimulation, at least at the beginning before you get adaptation. And so you just turn it on so they feel it, and then you turn it off, and that's our sham condition. And we looked at the EEG before, during, and after 10 minutes of this experimental paradigm. We had hoped to look at the EEG signal during TACs, but we weren't able to. But we could look at it before and after our TAC stimulation. And so what did we find? We found that we did not entrain alpha oscillations. This is showing the alpha power frequency versus power spectral density in the pre and post sham conditions and the pre and post alpha stimulation conditions. And there was no difference in alpha power. Now, again, this is a very weak, very brief alternating current stimulation. There's lots of reasons why we may not have seen an effect here, but we didn't. We didn't see any lasting effect on tactile perception. During the stimulation period, perception was lower with alpha stimulation. And after the stimulation period, it didn't persist. It was slightly lower, but it wasn't statistically significant. What we did find was that this brief weak stimulation had an impact on the evoked response, right? So we're giving these taps to the finger. They're doing our tactile detection task. And we looked at the evoked response before we gave 10 minutes of tacs and after. We saw that after we had an increased 70 millisecond peak. And this turned out to be a significant effect in the alpha condition, but not the sham condition. And so here's where we said, okay, we have something that this brain stimulation is doing to the circuit. Can we apply our HNN technology? Hold on one second, I just lost you guys and I want to bring you back. There you go. Our HNN software to understand what's going on in the underlying circuit that's producing this effect with our brain stimulation. And so here we are in our HNN GUI. And we've loaded in the evoked response from our pre-tax condition. This is actually, I'm sorry, the data, I don't know if I've loaded in the data here. I think this is our model. This is our model evoked response. And what we used for the model evoked response was that input sequence that I've already described to you, right? We've described the tactile evoked response without brain stimulation. And so we use that input sequence and we fit it to our pre-tax response. And then we go in and we start to test hypotheses. What do we think this brain stimulation is doing to the local circuit? And so the main hypothesis that's out there about what brain stimulation doing is it's changing the local synaptic plasticity. It's somehow impacting the efficacy of these synapses to create a difference in the cortical circuit dynamic that we might or might not be able to measure with EEG. And here's what we've actually measured with EEG. And so we went into the software and we said, can we start to play around with the local EI balance and see if those changes can reproduce this difference in the signal that we're seeing? And there's an easy way to do that in our graphical user interface. You go into this set parameters button, and then we have this feature called Synaptic Gains. And if you look at Synaptic Gains, you can automatically change the strength of the E to E, E to I to E, twofold, onefold, threefold. And so the first thing we did was we said, well, what if we increase the strength, double the strength of all the synapses? And then we go in and we hit run simulation. And what we found was that, yes, this did create this lower peak, but it also created this higher peak out here, which we didn't see. And so then we said, well, maybe it's only impacting the excitatory synapses. And so we tested to see, what if we only change the strength of the excitatory synapses? If we only change the strength of the excitatory synapses, the ERP goes in the opposite direction, right? Over here, we want it to go down and to stay down, but over here it went up and it stayed up. So it's likely not just the E connections. And so then we said, well, what if we only change the inhibitory connections? And so we increased the strength of the I to E and the I to I. And in fact, with that, which is this red curve here, we were able to reproduce this lowering of the ERP that we found in our data. And so we have this prediction from the model that what's happening with this tax is that you're increasing the strength specifically of the inhibitory synapses. And it turned out this was consistent with an earlier study where they showed that if you use low intensity tax, and again, we used 1 milliamp, that's very low intensity. It's preferentially potentiating inhibitory synapses. And this was a study they did in an animal model. I can't recall. I think it's in mice. I forget right now. But that was confirming or validating that the predictions that are coming out of HNN are supported by the literature. The other thing that's nice about HNN is that you get lots of predictions that you can go in and test with invasive recording or maybe other imaging modalities. And so we can go in and, for example, we can look at the spiking activity of the different neurons in the circuit. And so I'm going to show you that next. Here's the spiking activity in each of the cell classes in our model, color-coded. This is from the ERP before we simulate the tax condition. And this is in our post-tax condition where we've increased the local inhibition twofold. And what this is saying is actually what's happening when we increase the inhibition, we're getting less pyramidal neuron firing at this 70, 80 millisecond response. The pyramidal neurons here are in green and red. And so if you increase the local inhibition, you tap the finger, you get a decreased response at this 70 millisecond period. Interestingly, it looks like that corresponds to a bigger ERP, right? This goes down a little bit further. But it turns out excitatory currents push you up, inhibitory pull you down, and so we get this downward direction of the current flow. And so now we have these very targeted predictions about what's going on in the underlying circuit that you can go in and test further, again, in animal models or with other imaging modalities. You could use GABA spectroscopy. There's lots of imaging tools that we can use to start to both test these predictions, but help us develop our HNN model by making sure that we get all the underlying circuit dynamics right. Okay, so now what? So our stimulation pattern didn't work, right? We tried to recreate and train this alpha oscillation. We didn't entrain alpha. And so we've been taking a step back over this last few years and looking more closely at our data. And what we find is that there isn't this ongoing alpha oscillation. There isn't an ongoing beta oscillation. But when you look in the unaveraged data, everything that I showed you before was averaged. We averaged across approximately 100 trials, and you see these nice bands of activity. But when you don't average and you look at one single trial, right, the brain's not averaging. It's just the spontaneous activity is happening, and then I'm tapping the finger. What you can see as the alpha and beta activity is very transient. We've quantified the beta component quite a bit, and on average, typically it lasts less than 150 milliseconds. And so at any moment in time, you're going to either have one of these, what we call beta events or not beta events. And now we're trying to use a better understanding of what's going on naturally in the brain to develop better non-invasive brain stimulation paradigms. And we have tutorials now on how to simulate these transient alpha and beta rhythms that I'm not going to go into details of in this talk, but I just want to point out that they are there. And what we're doing now with our non-invasive brain stimulation, with this knowledge that, no, we don't have these continuous oscillations. We have these sporadic stochastic events. What we're doing is we're trying to develop new paradigms that rather than entrain an oscillation, try to mimic these transient nature of this activity. Give these brief punctate stimuli that are mimicking the natural brain dynamics. The other thing that we're doing is we're integrating our modeling framework into some of the field modeling. And so there's a lot going on in the scientific world trying to simulate the electrical fields that these non-invasive brain stimulators are producing in the brain. And so we want to map these field models with our HNN model and see if we can actually simulate what these fields are doing to this local cortical circuit. Okay, so now I'm just going to briefly describe some other applications. I'm not going to go into detail, but I just want you to be aware that these are available with HNN. We've used it to study gamma rhythms. Gamma rhythms are a very strong signal, particularly in these experiments that they do in humans where they give visual gratings. And this is true in humans and animals. But if you give a static or a moving grating, you see this huge gamma response in the visual cortex. And you can see it very clearly in source localized MEG and EEG signals. And so we've used HNN to try to test some hypotheses about where these gamma rhythms are coming from. I don't know if you guys have studied gamma rhythms in the workshop, but there's this ping mechanism, pyramidal interneuron gamma. That's one of the primary hypotheses about where gamma rhythms come from, and we've investigated that in HNN. There is a tutorial on it, so please check that out if you're interested. As I've mentioned, we've also used HNN to study these transient alpha and beta events that when you average across multiple trials, it looks like the spontaneous oscillation. But in HNN now, we're trying to understand where does the stochastic nature of these brief events come about. And we have some tutorials on that as well. Some of the other applications, we just published a paper using HNN to look at auditory evoked responses and differences in hemispheric differences in these evoked responses, and made some predictions about what's creating those hemispheric differences. There's a study looking at the mechanisms of MEG signatures of children with autism spectrum disorder by some of our collaborators at Mass General Hospital. Dr. Mohammed Sharif, who either you did hear from or will hear from, is using HNN to develop hypotheses on the circuit effects of ketamine for depression by looking at what ketamine is doing to the EEG signals. We're doing some developmental work with Doug Chain at Sick Kids in Toronto to see if we can understand some changes in MEG signals during development. And there's a whole list of publications using HNN on our website. HNN is a new tool. It's been developed over the last couple of years. And when I say that, I mean the graphical user interface. The underlying model has been used in lots of prior publications, mainly from my own lab, but now there's starting to be some other groups using the model now that we have this graphical user interface. Okay, and so in the last couple of minutes, and I'm realizing now I probably did go over, but I only have a few more slides. I just want to talk about some of what we're doing with command line interface integration with NetPyNE. And so when we first developed this software, the underlying code worked, but it wasn't very clean. And we did not design it as an open source tool. And so now that it's becoming an open source tool, we've been spending a lot of time to clean up the code, underlying code. We've recently released, and this being spearheaded by Maynak Yas at Mass General Hospital, a version of the code that we call HNN Core. This is a command line interface only. And there are some, it's distributed on GitHub. We have some documentation with the API, and I'm showing over here some of the examples of use that are following some of the examples on our tutorials page. And so if you can first start by understanding the tutorials through our GUI, given the modeling expertise that you now have through this workshop, you might be able to go in and start to use the command line code to, which is just more flexible to use. If you're a coder and you want to get in there and just do lots of things fast, this is a good way to do it. And we would love for people to help develop the software once they start using it for their own studies. The other thing we're pushing hard on is integration with NetPyNE. And Salva has created, I'm giving you the GitHub link here for the latest version of our NetPyNE integration. And Salva has created several examples of how you can use the HNN workflows in NetPyNE developed models. And so our original HNN model was converted to NetPyNE specifications in this plot simulate evoked. I think it's this one, Salva, even though this one says A1. I think this is actual, or maybe it's this divergence example. Anyway, one of these examples is, I think it's the divergence example, is the evoked response simulation that I showed you that's on our website and now in NetPyNE specifications. We're still working to organize the NetPyNE, HN and NetPyNE, and there's not a lot of documentation, but again, if anybody's interested in working in this realm, we're welcoming developers. Oh, let me get back to. Sorry, I lost my mouse and now I can't seem to. That. I'm frozen. Oh, there it is. All right, hold on. There you are. Okay. So that brings me to my conclusion slide. HNN is a neocortical column model under thalamocortical and cortical drive. It simulates the primary currents underlying EEG and MEG signals based on their biophysical origin, but with enough detail to connect these macro scale dynamics to the underlying cellular and circuit level activity. We have a website where we're distributing the software and tutorials of use for some of the most commonly measured signals. And hopefully I've convinced you that HNN can be applied to understand the neural origin of both healthy and pathological EEG and MEG dynamics, and can ultimately guide the development of novel therapeutics, including non-invasive brain stimulation and pharmacology. And so before I end, I just want to thank my collaborators. HNN and the examples that I showed you today are being developed by lots of people, and I'm very grateful to have this interdisciplinary network of collaborators that allow us to do this kind of research. The HNN development team, we have a picture here, and there's Salva, from one of our last meetings, but it's being developed by a group at Brown, Martino Center at MGH, the Neuron team at Yale, and Sam and Salvador and some of the team, Joe at Nathan Klein in SUNY Downstate. So with that, I'm going to conclude, and I'm happy to answer any questions. And again, I think Mohammed is going to present on using HN and NetPyNE for that ketamine study.
Thank you very much.
Thank you again for the opportunity.
Do you have any questions?
I have a question. Thank you for your talk. How you deal with non-uniqueness of solution? For example, you mentioned that these ERPs are mostly about feed forward and feedback, but I could imagine from theory that probably the same effects could be observed just using local excitation inhibition, interaction with local exciter inhibitory cells with appropriate synaptic weights. They could generate activity at any frequency, basically. So how you deal with it?
Yeah, so this is why we consider HNN to be a hypothesis testing and development tool. So if you have a hypothesis that maybe it could be generated by local excitatory inhibitory interactions, then you can test that hypothesis, right? You can go in and you could say, okay, I'm going to try to do it with one input to the local circuit and see if I can tune the strengths of the E and the I in order to reproduce the same signature, and you can use some optimization tools. But you can't, it's not yet saying, okay, here's all the parameter space that will create this ERP. Maybe there's a ton of parameter space that will create that ERP. But we're trying to use what we know from invasive recordings, use what we know from prior literature to see, can we not just have it be I call it the magic machine that says, here's all the ways that this can be generated, but can we get to a baseline principled understanding of where these things come from, knowing what we know from animals, from literature, from other experiments. Now, I say that we are working right now on building in some machine learning parameter estimation to get distributions of parameters that might account for your signal. So, you know, we very carefully tune the strength of the excitatory and the strength of the inhibitory input. How carefully does that need to be tuned? Is there a cloud of parameters? Again, sticking with not all parameters, but the ones that we think are biophysically important for the question that we're asking. And I can tell you right now, if you simulate an ERP with this sequence of drive, first of all, I couldn't do it. When I first started this project, I thought it was going to be excitation, inhibition, excitation, right? All local network. I could not get the waveform to match the waveform of my data. So that's where I was like, that didn't work. And then I went to literature and found these recordings where, oh, at 70 milliseconds, there's this feedback input. Let me try that. And that's when things started to come about. So you may be able to get the waveform different ways, probably not always, because it's just that what you get out of the model is dictated by structure. There's structure to these pyramidal neuron dendrites. There's structure to these inputs. You can't get anything you want from any parameter regime. And so oftentimes There's only one or a few ways that it actually works. But the other thing, I just lost my train of thought. Oh, we're building, I told you about the machine learning framework. I had another thought in my head that I thought that I lost. That I tried it with to get the EI and it just didn't work. Oh, here's my thought. You get lots of other predictions out of the model. So you tune the ERP to match the ERP, and maybe you can do that 3 different ways. I guarantee you the underlying spiking pattern is going to be different. The underlying LFP and CSD will be different. And so those differences give you targets to say, okay, well, let's use some other animal studies or imaging modalities. I've got 3 candidate mechanisms. They all produce the same dipole, but they all have different spiking, and they all do something different in the different layers, and they all have different CSD patterns. Which one of those is the real one? And so you get these targeted predictions, but it's not the end all be all. This is the way that brain does it. We think of it as a hypothesis developing and testing tool. Let's start to generate some biophysically grounded hypotheses and then keep pushing the envelope and testing these and changing things.
Thank you. Thanks.
I think Marco has a question.
Yeah, I think sometimes there could be a combination of local events, as Nikita said, and also the population's level. Is like the population level could select certain subspatial oscillation, as you already said, in beta oscillation, and the underlying local computations could tune some gamma pattern related with the visual object or other like sensitive, and could be quite a combination of both dynamic that could coexist, multiple hypotheses that could coexist in reality or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that we're seeing when we look at the spiking activity is that you can see when you tap the finger, you're driving little gamma, you're driving little ping oscillations, EI, EI, EI. You're not seeing it at the macro scale. You're not seeing them in the current dipole signal. But when you look at the spiking, you do see that pattern of gamma oscillation is there. The other thing is you're absolutely right that we only see something outside of the head, right? We see this beta, but there could be this, beta, gamma, and all these interesting things co-occurring. And what we're trying to do is develop a tool where you can start to investigate that and seek, how do I get how do I get gamma simultaneously with beta? What do I need to do in the local network in order to get that expression? Now, part of the reason we're converting to NetPyNE is, you get this hardwired cortical column model that we have been using with HNN. We want to be able to have flexibility, right? So you can change the local network patterns easily. You could add a different cortical column if you wanted to, an A1 column, for instance, that Salve has been developing, or a ZEM1 column, or you could change the local connectivity to start to ask these other questions that the community wants to ask. But that's our goal is we're focused on human, right? Our goal is let's get the EEG, MEG signal right, and let's get the community a tool where they can start to ask the questions they want to ask about where these signals are coming from.
Any other questions?
I thank you for the talk. I really enjoyed it. My question is a little primitive. So, have you tried like different somatosensory inputs, like a pinprick or a pinch, or and did you get the same kind of a waveform, or were different signals evoked, or any other fascinating inputs when or results something?
You're breaking up a little bit, but I think I heard the question about, have we looked at any other somatosensory evoked responses? And so right now we're working on a publication where we're looking at laser evoked responses. So from painful stimulus. So you give a heat stimulus and it causes pain. And one of the things that's really interesting there is I showed you in a tap to the finger, it goes up and then down and then up again.
Yes.
With the heat evoked, it's going down first.
Wow.
Which suggests a completely different pathway of information flow into the local cortex.
I see. I see. And I also had another question, but the discussion with Nikita actually solved it, because I was thinking that the up and the down and the up kind of looks like a double derivative of a single spike. So maybe there's like an underlining spike when recorded extracellularly would produce a down and an up. But then when you explained the thing with when Nikita asked about the uniqueness and you explained the entire process, that question was cleared. So.
Yep. And I encourage you to start playing around, because you'll see very clearly that you need a whole population response in order to get this macro scale signal.
And I wanted to mention that the HNN model is actually available through the NetPyNE GUI. So we have the file there. If you guys go to import and select hnn.py, you will get, I think I'm sharing my screen. You actually get the whole network model, and you get this very nice visualization. You can run the model. So it's also available through the GUI if you want to play with it.
Selva, what kind of inputs can they give through that? Do they have to define the inputs, or are there some that are automated?
The inputs are the default ones for the evoked response, and through the GUI, it's not possible to modify some of the inputs, but of course they can modify them programmatically. So in the GUI, you have like a Jupyter notebook where you can change all the parameters. So you can actually change them through the GUI interface and then see the results visualized.
Excellent. And please be in touch if anybody has questions or wants to get started using this in NetPyNE with us or anything. We're happy to help the community get started.
Okay, so I know you have to leave. So thank you so much again. It was a fantastic talk, and we're very grateful. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity. I'm glad to have been able to present to you all. So enjoy the rest of the week.
Thank you.
All right, bye everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.